Anything that our loyal TAs, Shiran and Abhishek, want to add as we get started? I don't hear any reply. Yeah, Abhishek, Shiran, anything you want to add right now as we start? Somehow we're mute. Are you mute or am I mute? I don't hear anything.
I'm good.
Okay. All right. Now I hear you. Good. You hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I have a PowerPoint I'll do myself today. And then I also have a few things from, that's more for Scenescapes, for Kentuckville Karaoke. Could either of you see if you can get it from the Canvas? If there's something on Canvas, and if so, we can use that as I start now. If it's not available, tell me that, and I'll hold up the book and page numbers. It should be on Canvas, I think, with that title, Kentuckville Karaoke. Okay. And as you can see, we're meeting online, as I just sent out an email for this week and next week. The two books are interrelated, Kentuckville Karaoke and Scenescapes. We've asked you to try to probably purchase a copy for more ready access. I think it's there. We may have some excerpts online, and certainly the Scenescapes book and I think Kentuckville Karaoke are both available as Kindles or something like that, electronic books. I'm going to just cover a couple of the big points in Kentuckville Karaoke and link them to some of what we've done in the last sessions and pave the way for more general coordination with the rest of the course. One big, well, the Kentuckville Karaoke has three main sections. The first is on following the title, does participation generate trust and legitimacy? And this I'll hold up as it's in the book on page 18. And if we find this, Shiran, in something you can list, fine. Otherwise, I only have a couple of pages like this, and I'll just hold them up. What this shows you is three levels of boxes and arrows. The boxes and arrows, I'll just remind you, are an idea that we use through the course, and it's codified a bit in this Blaylock extra reading in the first week. So if you haven't seen that, glance at that, and that sort of just talks about the idea. Try to summarize the big ideas clearly and simply. And this illustrates the first line, which says, if it's hard to read, in first box, it says civic participation leads to more trust and legitimacy. And that's the big idea of Tuckville and of Putnam. Civic participation, as in little churches in America, which did not exist in France or the more hierarchical societies around the world, generates more trust. Okay, that's the big idea that we're getting, that this book challenges. And that's why we asked, can Tuckville karaoke? But let's just for now say this is the first big theme in the book. The second big theme, so in a sense, this is political legitimation, civic activities, citizens engagement, and civic participation can include protests, demonstrations, marches, social media, of which we are getting a lot these days. Heightened to some degree by COVID because people are not so much in the streets. So the internet can serve as a vehicle for some, but not all, okay, in different ways. The second big section is economic. And the core idea here is what drives economic development. And again, we're gonna build on in what I'll briefly go over. The second big theme is it's a new idea in urban development literature, but it's a solid, very central idea in the last 20 years, roughly, especially among primarily, well, I shouldn't say primarily, especially among Western European, North American interpreters of where and why do we get economic development. And we go through a range of past and then current theories, but the big newish idea, I won't try to go into detail, but I'll simply say for now I'm introducing the three. Bohemia, arts, participation, and engagement of individual citizens through consumption as well as through production are a quasi-revolutionary new way to generate economic development. Richard Florida has codified this most in his book, The Rise of the Creative Class. And this has been publicized and used and debated around the world. Okay, we again challenge that in part, but not throwing out of either of these first two theories. Instead, we say if we can revise these and adapt them, we can use these theories internationally, but not everywhere and not for everything. And so how to do that is the third section of the book. And so if that's the overview, let me go through those a little bit more specifically, and we can discuss them briefly, and then we'll go on with the next scenescapes ideas. Okay, to summarize, if we go to this, the second line, so I would call the first line models 1 and 2, that am I gathering from the lack of something here, Shiron, that you don't find this in the Canvas?
Yes.
So the answer is no, you do not find it?
No, I can't find the book on Canvas.
You say you do or do not?
Do not. I cannot find the book on Canvas.
Okay, well, that's fine. I'll just present stuff here. And this is one of our recommended books. So I think it's there somewhere, but I'm not sure quite where. That is on Canvas. The first line is called Model 1 and 2 because it can be positive or negative. It's positive in Northwest Europe. That is Tocqueville wrote about democracy in America, but as it got elaborated in later years, especially say by Max Weber, Weber drew a sharp distinction between Northwest Protestant Europe and Southern Europe with Catholicism, the Roman tradition, Roman Catholic Church, and within how these then spread internationally in the colonies of the respective countries, including the US as a colony of both France and Spain, or that is of all three, France, Spain, and England. So France, Spain, in that sense, the regions within the US have their origins via Elazar in these distinctive political cultures in Europe, but they link to differentially, is the hypothesis, the dynamics which are below, namely if we look at the data today on trust, and there are lots of surveys done all around the world every few years now. The biggest and most consistent and comparable are the International Social Survey Project, the ISSP, also called GSS in the US or in Korea or other countries within that country, General Social Survey, and the WVS, the World Values Survey. These report on confidence in citizens, by citizens, in police, newspapers, the government, local government, national government, your friends, people you know. That it is some of these, and many of these, there's often a standard list of 4 or 5, but it can be as many as 15. So we've got lots of detailed studies which show they're very differentiated patterns of trust internationally. One of the highest is China. Chinese citizens have something like a 90% trust level in their national government. They generally have lower trust in their local governments, but they're still very high. And this is clear also in COVID right now, where we have survey reports for about eight different regions of China, and the largest city in each of those regions in a paper published by Carrie Wu, CARYWWUs at York University. The lowest in the world generally is Latin America. Africa is not so consistently surveyed, so generally Africa is like Latin America, but we know more about the Latin American surveys, and those have been consistently analyzed. And if for roughly 90% of people say, yes, I trust people in general, I trust the national government, in Latin America, it's like 10%, 8%, 15%. It's very low. People don't trust government in Latin America. And people may take different perspectives on why. That's a hard, bigger question. But the simple question of where and why is there trust or not is dramatically different. But then if you go within the countries, things get more complicated. For example, who trusts the most within the US or in Europe? High or low educated people? What would you guess? In general, more highly educated people in the US and Western Europe trust governments and trust people in general more. Lower educated, lower income persons generally trust less. In China, it's the opposite. Anybody want to comment or offer an interpretation of why? Okay, we can leave that as a question and saying that's the kind of thing so let me add one more point. This idea about trusting through civic participation, stressed as a big distinguishing factor for Tocqueville. He wasn't interested Tocqueville was essentially not interested in America. Tocqueville was interested in France. He was paid by the French to say, what's the future of Europe? What's the future of France going to look like? How can we adapt to it? So they didn't care about America per se, but they wanted to know what's France going to be like in if we have this crazy animal called democracy. And the same thus is true today, that within different regions of the world, we get big differences, especially in what you call democracy. So the idea that democracy is linked to voting is not necessarily essential. Many Americans talk as if, oh yeah, we have democracy, or people will say in the Middle East, no, we don't have a democracy because we can't vote for more than one party or something like that. Others say voting's not essential. It's participation in organizations, and voting is going down. Voting's been going down, especially in the last 30 years or so, all around the world. The turnout rates are going down generally. However, little organizational participation is going up. Sidney Verba, Norman Nye, Henry Brady are the main authors of papers in the American Political Science Review and books on this. Putnam is distressed by this. So Putnam's Bowling Alone stresses that very much, that civic participation is going down. That is, he's disagreeing with Verba and Nye, saying not only is voting going down, so is civic participation. And that's a bigger challenging problem, because they should generate legitimacy, and we're going to lose legitimacy. And in a sense, he would say we might have things like like Donald Trump as president, and these populist leaders, not just Trump, but Macron in France, others in Brazil, the Philippines, elsewhere, you could say are having a more, I talked about the Italians, and I contrasted Jimmy Carter and the French and Italians at the beginning, say, oh, these American, Jimmy Carter's just a silly Southern rural boy, doesn't know anything about real politics. That's Kissinger. Okay, so that's changed, but where and why are the dynamics working differently in different regions? And this is where Putnam's book on Italy is a landmark. Putnam's book on America, called Bowling Alone, is a much bigger bestseller, but it is simplistic. It is too simple, and it has too simple a story, which is a simplified version of Tocqueville. And it's the first line in what I just showed you. And it's that simplified version which we then checked with our collaborators in Asia, especially, well, Europe and Asia. That is, we knew more or less the European results. Trust more in Northern European Protestant, trust less in Southern European Catholic. How about Asia, and why is Asia different? This was the topic of a PhD here by Seoko Kim. And he's from Korea. He was here working with the General Social Survey across the Midway. It's a building called the National Opinion Research Center. It now has some undergraduate majors that some of you go there for. Used to be the Harris School of Public Policy, but that too has moved. Okay, so and NORC was shared this space. So the interesting thing is NORC is part of this ISSP, which is international, global, with China, Korea, Japan, India. And so the finding of Seoko Kim working on these international variations found for Korea that, first of all, the Koreans participate more than Americans. Americans do not participate as much as Koreans do, especially in churches. Churches are over the top. It's the biggest way that Koreans participate, and it's central. And they also say they're religious. I won't go into that, but it's civically very, very active. Does this civic participation and religious participation in big churches, the huge evangelical activities of Koreans, they go all over the world. They're sometimes called Mormons. They're sometimes in separate individual churches. They go to Africa, they go to Latin America, and they are the major spurs of many of these transformations in the last 50 years. Does this generate more trust inside Korea? No, that was the dramatic finding of Seoko Kim. Those Koreans who participate more do not build more trust. Hey, so we then said to Seoko, when he was working on his PhD, how many other countries is this true of? Maybe we haven't challenged Tocqueville enough. So he used about in his paper here, the thesis and then the section of the book which he did. He had maybe 20 or so major European countries, and he has a brief discussion of some of it here. But he's got details from the US and Korea here for variables like socioeconomic status, with especially high school, and then this is high school, and then controls by age, by race, by gender, by working full-time, Protestant, Catholic, parental status, living in the American South, big city, suburbs, associational membership. So these are things he brought in as controls. And they shift results in the US substantially. In Korea, not very much. Okay. The dramatic finding then, when he said, what other countries don't have an impact on their trust from these kinds of activities? And his answer was Portugal, Brazil, the former Soviet areas, Russia, Eastern Europe, parts of Eastern Europe, and China to some degree. That is, more participation did not seem to increase trust. China, I won't try to go into right now, except to say this is important. That is, these are not consistent everywhere, and where and why they vary became a big issue in discussions we had for the with the Koreans especially, but we then engaged, because of that finding, we dug out two collaborators that we'd work with, Felipe Silva and a couple of his assistants who are working on PhDs. Susana Farina Cabaco was the main one. And with their Korean and with their Portuguese interest and their collaboration with some Brazilians, we tried to look at, what's different, especially because Portugal was different from Spain. Everybody talks about Portugal and Spain, they're very similar, they're right next to together, but they had the opposite results on this finding. More participation did tend to increase trust in Spain, but not in Portugal. Okay, so we're getting these national level results. But to try to figure this out and to go down into more subtlety, not only did he add more variables, as I mentioned, but we added more countries and then more selective, different methodological kinds of studies, case studies, qualitative discussions of particular kinds of organizations like unions, gangs, redefining Bohemia and Seoul, Korea, and Chicago was a separate book that we did in a 2-year project collaboration with the city of Seoul. Then we pursued some of this in a collaboration with the mayor of Paris. Okay, so let me give you just a couple of takeaways here. What we call Model 3 and maybe 4 shows civic participation again in the top, but it may be 0. The path may be 0 to trust and legitimacy. And it may be that non-civic variables like the family, the work group, are building trust in Asian countries that have, for example, karaoke. I won't try to go into that right here, but that's the title of the book. Can karaoke substitute for civic activities? Karaoke is not a civic activity. It's a leisure group. You go to a restaurant, you go to a club, you sing, you eat and sing and drink. And the classic Asian version is you go with the people you're working with. You don't go with your family, you don't go with your friends, you don't choose them yourself. Your boss says, okay, we're quitting work and we're all going to dinner together now. And that's classic from that has gone down in frequency in Korea, China, Japan, but it's still there and people know it well. And it's the major thing that is surveyed, for example, in the Chinese family panel survey in terms of a leisure activity. We've got lots of data on karaoke. The fourth line, the fourth model, is negative impact. Civic participation can suppress trust and legitimacy. Why might that occur? Is what this asks as well in this section. Because if you've got some people for whom trust and legitimacy rises, for others, it must be logically also going down. In if we are to have if we have an entire nation where we have let's say a weak or 0 relationship, probably there's some that are positive and some that are negative. So as we came back from Seoul, let me just mention personally, 26JAN was a student, also did a BA and a PhD here. Then he went back, he's professor at the University of Seoul. He helped organize a big conference with the mayor of Seoul a couple of years ago, and Richard Florida and I and about 20 Koreans were there, mostly Korean and some Japanese, some Canadian, some Europeans, but mostly Korean experts on where and why these kinds of things ought to work powerfully or less so. And the Florida argument was, you've got to participate and be bohemian if you want to have democracy and if you want to have economic development. We saw they didn't have that. That's the result of Seok Kim. Florida was angry, so they just don't get it here in Asia. They don't get it here in Korea. I'm going back to Canada or the US. He is professor in Toronto and New York and Florida. I stayed on for a couple of weeks in Korea and a couple of weeks in Japan and listened and said, why are we getting these findings that don't seem to fit the Western theory? Theories, plural. And the 7 years or so later, the result is chapter 2. And the title is Karaoke Together versus Bowling Alone. Scenes illuminate how Western rules can be transformed to drive development and democracy. Co-authors Chad Anderson, Mireille Bayan. So people, mostly Koreans, and Yoshiaki Kobayashi from Japan, Clemente Navarro from Spain, Dan Silver, and Di Vu from China. Okay. We spent hours and hours, meetings, draft papers, and so forth. And one thing we looked at was, where are there exceptions within the US, for instance? You think of something that is, why might we have pattern 4 where participation, more civic participation somewhere in the US, or let's say probably also Western Europe, might lead to less legitimacy and trust. Anybody want to guess? Think of if you're from India or you're from your own country or any other country or city within the US or subgroup within which dormitory or which people in your part of your dormitory or that you've lived in here fit or don't fit, and why? How about unions? How about gangs in US cities? Imagine you're a school teacher and the American Federation of Teachers says, okay, come out and mobilize. We're going to fight against this mayor of Chicago. Rahm Emanuel, his main battle as mayor of Chicago for 2 terms was the teachers union. They killed him. But if you're a teacher, some teachers, and I met with the national union after I published one book. I was invited to there's a monthly meeting of the AFT, American Federation of Teachers, and they have the presidents from the big cities around the US, I think the 50 biggest cities, and they all meet once a month and they talk about their problems. The ones from Chicago and New York said, fight for more money, raises we want for everybody. Don't get involved with other things. By contrast, the AFT leaders in places like Portland, Oregon, Seattle would say, I think in Minneapolis, would say, listen, we should represent our teachers, our parents, and our students. We don't want to fight just for more money and seniority. People become teachers because they want to try to help people learn. They want to help learn more in the classroom. They want to make classrooms more exciting. And we want things to work better. And we should work with parents and we should work with students to try to do this, whether it involves testing or not testing or taking more breaks or whatever. And I'll just add that since that was going on, this has exploded more in Scandinavia. In Denmark, they now have very so-called progressive education, where they have virtually no homework. And the surveys show that the students in Denmark love to go to school. They have a great time, they have lots of fun, and they're learning a lot. Okay. So if we think of different schools like Chicago has some of the worst schools in the United States in terms of test scores, in terms of quality of student outcomes, in terms of percentage of students going to higher education, etc. If you participate a lot in the AFT union and you're in a Chicago or New York, should you trust the mayor and the students and life more or less? It would seem consistent with this thinking that you'd trust less, that you'd be, the more you participate in the teachers union, the more you're battling against the mayor. You're saying this mayor is closing schools, he's forcing us to do this or do that. And under Rahm Emanuel, for the first time, the neighborhood groups allied with the teachers union to fight against City Hall. And they both were very distrustful of Rahm Emanuel. Okay. That in turn led into Lori Lightfoot being elected. But one of the most controversial issues was what was her position and Tony Preckwinkle's position on education. And everyone thought Tony Preckwinkle was going to win, but she had been a teacher, as was her husband. They were both students of mine when they were here at the USC. And she got into enough trouble with the debates they had in the last bits that she got she was defeated by Lori Lightfoot. Okay, and Lori Lightfoot basically stressed, nobody trusts the schools, nobody trusts this mayor, and you need a new mayor that will change everything. That was her basic message. And the fact that she won shows there are a lot of dissatisfied, angry people. So she in turn was hugely distressed when people revolted against her or blamed her and how she was handling the police or the lack of policing a year or two ago. Okay. So the simple hypothesis is, and who was involved, or say, I mentioned, I think that I live across the street from Dunbar High School. Dunbar High School has Chicago police cars outside of it at 3 o'clock. They escort the kids who come out of school so that they can walk home through alien gang districts. You get killed if you go through the wrong district and you're wearing the wrong kind of clothes or something which shows a hat or a symbol which can potentially identify you with a different gang. And you've got to know which neighborhood that means and not walk through the wrong neighborhood acting or wearing the wrong kind of clothes. So kids in high schools have to read on the internet to see how you can dress and not get killed, and then in those particularly difficult areas, follow the police cars. So the police then escort the students, and that happens daily right here. Okay, so the idea is if you're more active in a gang like that, you may well distrust the police, distrust the government more. And that seems to be the case if we look at things like, we have a whole lecture on this. I won't go into detail, but for now, the rappers and driller rap, the recordings that made by the gangs in Chicago. This was featured and originated really in Chicago. Driller rap gangs posting on YouTube insults and threats between one another. You do that and we're going to kill you. And then they in turn got killed, or there were then reprisals, and that's been going on for a couple of years. And the idea of driller rap and having gangs adopted has spread globally, alas, something where some people are not so proud of in Chicago, but it was arts related. It was not just killing people. It was making a video, so that the making of the video and your score on your YouTube rating of the video is what the gang shifted to focus on rather than the number of people actually killed. So this is featured in USC research here. Forrest Stewart had the lead book on this. All right, so how could this proposition that civic activities lead to trust or distrust be more sharply formulated to not give these contradictory results that I'm reporting to you in different studies? That's what we get to in part 3. So let me just spend a few minutes on part 2, and then we'll go to part 3 of the book. So part 2 is the one line that I'll show, which is a big takeaway here, is the rise of the arts. And I'll talk about this in the next section. But no, I don't. I'm not putting my finger on it right here. I'll show you that in 10 minutes or so. The arts have taken off. Does that lead to more economic development? This is the kind of hypothesis that comes from people working on the Florida creative class innovation argument. And it's very hot in Europe and the US among initially Florida, that is planners and some kinds of economists. Edward Glaser and Florida and I did it really, it was a book on, let me not get into that, except to say Edward Glaser is probably the sharpest urban economist in the country, PhD from here and professor at Harvard now. And we all worked on consumption and where and how the arts and consumption were really critical drivers in for the economy. Not just capital, not just labor, not just the traditional things. Okay. This doesn't work in Asia. The Asians, you talk to them, well, so let me just add one more point. The idea that bohemianism and creativity go together is a strong Western tradition, especially from France. Again, not just Tocqueville, but our originator of this was most recently Balzac, the novelist in the 19th century, most famous French novelist of that era. And he also said, you know, to write good novels or to be a good painter, to be a sculptor, you need to live in a neighborhood where the bourgeoisie won't torch you, that you have to be middle-class bourgeois, you have to wear the right clothes, you can't have long hair, and so forth. You can't eat, drink, sleep, etc. You have to be married, bad things like that. Okay, so Montmartre was the artist section when at that point. That then spread later to the Latin Quarter, and so the idea that distinctive neighborhoods could foster distinct bohemian lifestyles was then heightened further at the end of the 19th century by Baudelaire. And that was featured in turn by Walter Benjamin, his book called The Arcade Project. I'll talk about that briefly in a minute or two. But the late then Jane Jacobs, Schumpeter joined in variations of these in the mid to late 20th century. And this stands as a very central driver about concerning economic development today. It doesn't work in Asia. The Asians had never heard of bohemian. Most of the people, let's say 10 or 20 years ago, in China and Japan and Korea, dressed, let's say, like proper, I'm deliberately invoking, let's say, proper bourgeois, middle class. That is, you didn't wear, as people did in most American universities, t-shirts and jeans and running shoes to class. That was the uniform 20 years ago, right? Let's say the counterculture, after the counterculture of the late 60s, that continued in a sense is how American college students would dress. You go to Asia and you see women with high heels, elegant hairstyles and so forth. That's the way it was in Paris when I was a student decades before, but after 68, okay. So how did Bohemia change, and how has this varied in its linkage to these other things which may lead to economic development? That's the big question. And getting some results from different countries, different neighborhoods, as I mentioned, the Latin Quarter in Paris, or how Bollywood has changed in India, and where and why you get bits of Bohemia in Taiwan, but not in the mainland. And now we're getting bits of this elsewhere in different locations. But Richard Florida had a controversial, nice, simple measure. You measure Bohemia by the percentage and the percentage of gays in a neighborhood or a city. Or actually, he didn't have data on cities. He had whole metro areas. If you have more gays in a metro area, like the San Francisco Bay, San Francisco Bay Area, which was distinctly gay, then you have Silicon Valley, and you have all the booming of the computer industry. I mean, is that wildly deterministic? I mean, when he first published that, this seemed absolutely off the top. Can that be? I mean, is this the driver? Is it spurious? If it's spurious, what else is going on here? And so I got his data, I reanalyzed it, and I gave it to two or three research assistants. They worked on it for 6 months. I said, oh yeah, Florida's right. We got Florida's data. He gave us his actual raw data for the metro areas. And I said, but are all the variables working that way? Did you put them together? And said, oh yeah. So I said, let me play with the data. So I played with the data myself for a couple of weeks. And I found it that generally more gays, more computer tech, high-tech jobs across all US metro areas and counties. But then I added education. And if you add education, the gay effect falls generally to 0, which is to say it's spurious. The real driver was education. And then Ed Glazer at Harvard followed up and he did the same thing. And he said, sure, this is just human capital, it's economic theory. We said that since Gary Becker. Okay. So Florida has never really said, he's recently basically repeated the same arguments on national television shows and so forth. But the people who've looked at the data more closely say, hey, Florida, you're way overselling a variable. It is a variable which we should pay attention to, but there are other things which are related. Conformity, unmarried couples are widely, how do you measure conformity? So one crude measure is not just gays, but unmarried couples living together. And that correlates across US counties about pretty highly. But then we have lots of survey items that we can use, which I've then brought in the paper I had on this, and we get different results. Okay, I don't want to go on too much as I want to get to the next book. But I'm giving you a flavor of the first two sections, and the bottom line really is in the third, which is to say, if we bring in the arts and culture and look at where and how the arts work in different sorts, such as drill or rap, instead of the Star-Spangled Banner as traditionally sung, that should show more conformity, or at least more support for the leadership around you. And so what did we have with Biden? Who sang the Star-Spangled Banner for the Biden inauguration? Who knows that? Nobody knows that?
It was Lady Gaga, wasn't it?
Yes, good, there we go. Lady Gaga sang the Star-Spangled Banner. So that alone, and the combination of her with the unions, is an interesting commentary on what kind of coalition is Biden trying to build through this symbolic use of art and music. If we had, I mentioned we've also included ISIS in a number of things. The ISIS meetings, the first Middle Eastern meetings on protest and the Velvet Revolution and so forth, they featured poets. The leader, the president of the Middle Eastern ISIS had as a wife a poet, etc. Okay, so I'm going to leave this here briefly for now for reasons of time, except to say we got lots of data. We have many different interpretations in the last third of the book, and we try then to pull them together systematically in the last chapter, which is a little more complicated, so I won't try to oversimplify and summarize it for you here. I'll let you struggle with it a little bit, but look at the pictures. Just look at the graphs, and you'll get a flavor for what's there. Okay, let me then now shift to. I'm gonna save discussion for the end. It's simpler, I think, because what I've said overlaps with what I've got here in Scenescapes and more general comments, not just in the book. Since 1968 and 89, two big dates, we see complex confrontations among citizens civic groups, unions, and traditional political parties. And there are new types of groups and leaders who press for more ambitious policies like diversity and immigrant rights. And the new social movements, environmentalists, feminists, human rights, paved the way in the 70s, but the 21st century went much further after Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, the Occupy movements from Wall Street and hundreds of other cities, the fall of the leaders in Cairo, Kiev, and more, with repercussions from Buenos Aires and Hong Kong. The new movements of many subpopulations and implement protests, parades, demonstrations with puppets and poets, songs, dances, created, directed carefully for videos of mass and social media. The Hollywood-style destruction of the World Trade Center and similar Parisian events orchestrated violence theatrically, not just Chicago. These created new, powerful scenes. Political responses to these include new populist leaders from Greece and Brazil, the Philippines, Kiev, and Mayor Ford of Toronto, and Donald Trump. What do sociologists or social scientists have to say about all this? As analysts, not just as personal moralists, theories of the crowd in the 19th century remain underdeveloped. We study many subjects in the social sciences, but the journals regularly use the same key explanations: race, class, jobs, gender, nationality of origin, 4 or 5 essential characteristics, age, maybe, to explain participation, and from things ranging from trust to happiness. And the mass media mobilize these 4 with specific events. But look more closely at any social science journal for the precise power of these factors, individually or combined: race, class, gender. The 4 seldom explain more than 15% of the variations within a single country. This means that 85% remains unexplained. These points are detailed in my books, The City as an Entertainment Machine and The New Political Culture. Alas, the modesty of these results is largely ignored by many talented commentators, such as Pierre Bourdieu, Jean-Claude Pesseron in their book on the heirs and distinction, Paul DiMaggio, Sharon Zukin, many more. We live in a highly probabilistic and weakly deterministic world, especially comparing nations. Studying cities and neighborhoods is a great way to analyze and sharpen the subtleties, hence the focus of this course, Global Local. A few persons are stressing new topics and processes beyond the traditional: public art, public space, creative placemaking, new migration dynamics, neighborhood differences are all here. And in this spirit, my first goal is to offer holistic concepts we can help to specify dynamic urban processes, not just urban, but then second, to sketch an approach which joins many more processes. And third, present some results comparing cities around the world. This approach is called the scene. It seeks not to replace, but to add to the classic concepts like class, race, and gender, and thus enrich our social science toolbox. Since the uprisings of 1968, then the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Tiananmen protests of 1989, the world has deeply changed. Yet many social scientists still teach as if we only had Adam Smith, Karl Marx, Max Weber, and Emil Durkheim. And urban theorists like Zimmel, the Chicago 20s ecologist, the early Castells, Logan and Molich's urban fortunes. We need to update these. How? About half of the manual labor force has disappeared since the 1950s in Europe and North America. Half the labor force, people work with their shoulders. Chicago was a city of big shoulders. No more. We live in an increasingly post-industrial world with new roles for cities. The Marxist analysis of industrial society no longer holds. Students are the new proletariat. Did you know that? Creativity, ideas, and culture have become essentials. We have to catch up to the public, the journalists, and a handful of urban political leaders building on 1968 and 89. Chinese designers of clothes, Korean and Japanese cultural policies, are transforming Asian export production, economics, and central planning to a new focus on consumption through the arts, directly targeted by strong governments. In China, mass rural-urban migration is not motivated simply by employment. Younger people in Asia challenge family and other hierarchies. The urban scenes of big cosmopolitan cities attract the young and talented. Beijing is seriously pursuing nightlife as a major new urban policy topic. New issues such as limiting environmental pollution, dealing with flood victims, and combating corruption have transformed the focus on economic growth in China and most of Asia. In Southern Europe, where Roman law and the Catholic hierarchy were the sources of many theorized past models, Frankfurt was seen as new. One day in Frankfurt, Adorno told the class, I was there, "You felt Hitler's boot, but Horkheimer and I went to the US where it was even worse. People there do not realize they were forced to smoke cigarettes, to see Hollywood movies, and to ride in big cars and lead a lifestyle imposed by advertising." Their famous Hollywood article uses these themes. Remember, though, the second face of Adorno is that of a subtle critic and nuanced atonal composer. So I propose that we pass over the first Adorno and extend the second. We must introduce the aesthetic and emotional power of the arts into our central thinking to better interpret how cities and citizens do so today. But why did Adorno stress advertising? Because it makes a direct link between capitalism and the consumer. It destroys consumer autonomy and individualism, as introduced by Walter Benjamin, with the flaneur as a causal social engine. Okay, let me try giving you some ideas. Let me give you a short break here as I'll try to get some. Host disabled participant screen sharing. I guess, can you please make me co-host or enable the screen sharing so I can do that? Sharon?
Sure, I can do that. Have we made you co-host?
Okay, thank you. All right, now I want to get over here to my PowerPoint. Oops, I got too many things here. Whiteboard. Let me look over here. Where have I got this thing? Scenes and cities. It's got the. Okay, here we go. Okay, do you all see that? You see scenes and cities showing on the screen? Shake your head, yes? Okay, good. All right, so as you see, this is a co-authored report. I've adapted it, used it 2-3 different times. This was the first, and I left the names here in this place just to have the variations included. And to thank you collaborators. I've emailed today to Marta Klokotko 3 times. Okay, so if we go down, 20th century, land, labor, and capital. And this was the theory from the 19th century, continuing for some today. But if we look at police and fire expenditures over 51 cities from 1880 to 1968, we find some big changes. That is, I won't go into this in detail now, but I'll just say the bottom line, this comes from a paper called The Irish Ethic, and it shows that the traditional Chicago ecology factors declined every decade or every couple of decades through the 20th century. Every single decade, their importance went down. What rose instead? Paris, or let me get back to my notes here. Walter Benjamin, the flaneur as a causal social engine. Benjamin's in-depth study of Paris's global significance today in our post-industrial era. Benjamin's Paris is an answer. Add shopping, entertainment, consumption, lifestyles, cafes, and the poetry of Baudelaire, who distilled these elements of street life. The recognition of Baudelaire as the leading intellectual of the Weimar Republic and Baudelaire as the most respected cultural model of the late 19th century France suggests that smart citizens surpassed the simple deterministic social theorists, then stressing race, class, and materialism, including class politics. Likewise, Baudelaire himself edited the Journal of Wagner Studies. Wagner wrote 5 volumes of prose before composing his most important music in The Ring of the Nibelung. He destroyed the classical tradition from Bach to Mozart and Beethoven. And his concept of the total artwork, the Gesamtkunstwerk, integrated huge numbers of little themes, combining theater, poetry, music, and a holism inspired by the people, its myths, its songs, and its moral foundations. Some of these concepts were taken up by Weber and Durkheim and talked about basic values by others later, but it was Levi-Strauss who explicitly codified the cultural content, including myths, in his 4-volume work on mythologique, myths. Production, social relations focused on producing goods and services remain the foundations of most social sciences, especially Marx, but not only. We're not proposing abandoning these, but rather to enrich them and to contextualize and reframe them. For us, the scene includes fields, worlds, and network elements, but the most decisive is to add more explicitly aesthetics, taste, what's good or bad in what you have on the table and how you look and dress. This was refused, especially after 1968, when many said studying culture would blame the victims. But William Julius Wilson, the distinguished African-American sociologist, later reversed this position, and it slowly changed others. Cities are an ideal way to lead the social sciences here. So just show you different theorists. Baudelaire in top right. Wagner and Levi-Strauss. Benjamin and Brecht having a tough conversation. The world is flat. Factors driving toward the new political culture. This we'll talk about later, so I'm not doing so explicitly here. Components of scenes. The bottom line has 15 dimensions of scenes, like traditionalism. Okay, these we can think about as a molecular aesthetic or toward a periodic table of cultural elements. What would this look like? It would start not with chemicals, but with discrete pieces of aesthetic sense, like tradition and neighborliness in this diagram. And since the same aesthetic dimensions are potentially present in all scenes empirically, but vary in intensity, these qualities can and should be isolated conceptually, at least, from each other. And then every pure ideal typical quality like local authenticity, transgression, self-expression has its own character. An empirical city or neighborhood is a unique combination of multiple abstract dimensions of scenes. That's the big idea. Don't say Hyde Park is different. Say, what are the dimensions which make Hyde Park different? Or your dormitory or your self? How to identify these deep structures? We did not invent any of the 15 dimensions shown here. They come from centuries of poetry, novels, cultural theory, and philosophy. Although they're not a closed system, these 15 deep structures correspond to the chemical elements. So we call this our grammar of scenes. It's on the bottom of this figure 2. Levi-Strauss built his mythologique explicitly from Wagner for his basic grammar, but he added context that we extend. A similar sensibility, I studied with Levi-Strauss and picked up a bit of this there. A similar sensibility is found in some of the classics of sociology, like Weber's ideal types, the Protestant ethic, the overseas Chinese, the Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, urban, rural. And our 15 dimensions are similarly explicitly general to permit combining them globally into multiple empirical scenes, like Hyde Park. This type of scene analysis starts from certain basic components. For us, the scenes include districts rather than the city as a whole or nation to capture more of these local differences and the more extreme cases. Like Levi-Strauss, we use not a few, but hundreds of elements to create the scenes. Postal codes are the smallest generally available units, over 40,000 in the US. To find this powerful microdata, it's necessary to study in depth the unpublished electronic archives, hitherto unseen. We use the electronic yellow pages with hundreds of different types of restaurants, churches. Okay, here across the side and then the top, these are ways you can transform one into the other. But this is more conceptual. If I go down one more, oops. Let me go back here. Ideally, we can use these techniques to convert these millions of data bits of the raw data into scenes dimensions for each neighborhood, as illustrated in abstract here, and I'll give you more examples as we go down. We also use photographs, case studies of dramatic instances. We aim both for the subtlety of artists, but the coherence of scientists. New kinds of data like social media and the internet downloads permit far more of both than in the past, illustrated in the digital humanities. New majors at the USC, which include these kinds of combinations of computers, social media, and capturing and analyzing the content of the social media. Does this break with past work on culture and the arts and much of the social sciences? We're now living with changes comparable to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution, but more complex and subtle. The scenes are emerging as a concept from the transformations of 1968 and 89, increased education linked to global migration, the internet, and new cultural ideals, but they're not universal. Specifics vary by small neighborhoods around the world. And we've schematized these major changes with a new political culture that I quickly showed you in 10 books on scenes summarized in an image of, which is there. There, I've got more, but we need a little discussion. We got 10 minutes left. So let me slide down through some of these while you're posing questions if you want, and I may use them to show, for instance, the rise of the arts here. But who has a question or comment? I'll ask a question. Have you heard how much of this have you heard before in another class? I bet you haven't heard all of this in any one of your classes, but I ask that each year and I haven't heard anybody who's, but comments or questions? Just giving you a couple of things to inspire you. How can you overcome the divides between the rich and the poor in America? What does so? Pop culture and martial arts. We didn't know that in advance. Neighborhoods that have got more of this have got more rich and poor people living together. Arts buzz is a new concept. Things like this in Paris, the Beaubourg Center. Contrasting cultural democracy and cultural policy, big changes over time in France in a short 20 years. And these are from our 3-year Parisian analyses. This is Poland. Poland. That is, a small town in Poland transformed itself through the arts. It had been a center of big, heavy industry with a Russian-inspired big factories. They tore them down and they did things like this, and they started putting on theater and plays, and it became a booming little town. It's a small town in rural Poland, devastated post-industrial. The arts transformed it. Bronzeville, the center of, what's the center? What defines Bronzeville? I'm working with the alderman and others here on a Bronzeville welcoming center. Archibald Motley, most famous Black painter, he tried to capture some of the feel of Black culture with this in Chicago, my neighborhood. Theaster Gates, okay, I don't want to, okay, so I want to show you briefly raw data. Look just at, say, Roman Catholic churches here. Have marked easily, but they're, Catholic churches is number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 763 Roman Catholic churches in Chicago's Cook County. 340 in New York's 5 boroughs, 225 in LA County. That says a lot. That's the deep structure of why Chicago is different. I don't want to overstate, but these other things give us the ability to get this down to the zip code and then to see how much do these things shift a neighborhood dynamic like, so yeah, on the right-hand half, I've got different neighborhoods in LA, smaller. Catholic churches, 0, 2, 1, 2. That is, there ain't many there. So, but questions? Suzanne, you've had good questions before. What are your reactions to all this stuff?
Yeah, I think it's all very interesting. I think the thing that I found the most interesting was what you said about progressive education earlier.
Yes, and what are the 2 leading institutions of progressive education in the world?
I know you talked about Denmark.
Yeah, right now. Historically, the Chicago Lab School, which is, right there on the Midway, and the what's the name of it? The Parker School in the North Side. When the French, there was a group of the French social scientists and Roman Catholic priests who were very progressive around 1880, 1890. They said, we want to change French national character. We've got to compete with the Germans and the Americans. We can't be hierarchical and authoritarian the way the French have been for centuries. How can we do it? New schools. So where'd they go? The Chicago Laboratory School. They brought back the ways of saying to the students, tell us what you think about this formula. How can we do that? Instead of saying, memorize this, do that, the teacher would ask, not just talk. And that then has exploded. And so the Danes are doing more of it, but it's The sources were here in good part because Thomas Dewey, leading pragmatist philosopher who worked on education, was here, and he inspired the sociology department to talk about interaction and how social interaction affects both of us who talk. So that's part of the foundation of what, then that leads in turn to network analysis and all kinds of other things. Any follow-ups about progressive education, or that is, where did you go to high school, Suzanne?
I went to a public school that was local in Rochester, New York.
Oh, that's right. Okay, so Rochester. So was it very progressive for, as you now see other options, or you not much?
I think it was kind of in the middle.
Okay. Because there's studies of high schools around the world, and Chicago has, the city has some of the worst test scores when you compare, especially with the Asians. Naperville, Illinois, has the highest test scores. #1 in physics, I think, and #3 in math in the world. Unbelievable. A couple of years ago. There's a book on this by a Harvard professor, psychologist. So, but the point is, the French saw this in 1890 and they tried to change French character. Didn't work. And Michel Crozier, a leading organizational theorist, continued the same, but his same idea was to abolish the lead school for training the high-level civil servants, called the ENA, the National School of Administration. So he said this school just teaches people to be arrogant. We've got to stop that for France to be more. And so the president of France today is a graduate of that school, but they've moved it. They didn't abolish it. They moved it from Paris to Strasbourg. So it's almost like abolishing it. So I'm just citing these examples of dramatic recent changes that have their roots that go back a century or more. And we've got different patterns in different neighborhoods today. And we can learn by comparing these. And so you can do cross-national research, and by just getting on your bike and going around the city of Chicago, which is what I do all the time for field work. I bike every other night, or sometimes every night when I'm in training. And it's a fantastic way, and as well as keeping healthy, especially. I've done this right through COVID. You're outdoors, going fast, stay 100 feet away from the next cyclist or walking person. And I've never had COVID. What else? Shiran, I've mentioned China a few times. Any reactions to some of my quick comments on China?
Not really, for now.
Okay. Shinjini?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on what I've said today?
Not really. I was thinking earlier, like you mentioned something that reminded me of like the reading, and like how there's a lot of like something about like how individualism like and like local groups or something, like it might lead to less trust. And I was just thinking about that earlier.
Yeah, maybe I didn't stress enough. The critical shifter variable is not just membership numbers, but the culture defining the type of meaning in the membership. So the culture in these examples are, for instance, drill or rap versus the Star-Spangled Banner. The music and the words of the Star-Spangled Banner celebrate patriotism of Americans. The drill or rap celebrates instead divisiveness of beating up and killing the other gang. and how tough I am, showing a submachine gun in your hands as you're making or dancing with, you know, violence, and it is a potential threat in the background. So if you do more of the one of the Star Spangled Banner, let's say, even if it's with Lady Gaga, that ought to lead to more support for the activity. If you're in an organization that does this, and that's why I say baseball games and football games have the Star Spangled Banner again and again and again. The idea is that football, baseball, these things are celebrating Americanism. Or I shouldn't say that, I mean, that's too simplistic, but they can be, they're celebrating the hometown or the home team. And the home team, when the home team is winning, you can feel it. Drive around or bike around Soldier Field when people are coming out and they lost the game. They look and act different than if they won the game. And that's been commented on by people for a long time. Or right now in China, the Olympics, the last Olympics in Russia were a huge driver, it seems, of, I shouldn't say driver. The rise of, that is the Olympics in China, the Olympics in Russia coincided with a dramatic increase in popularity of Putin. And President Xi is hoping for the same and maybe asking for that by saying, let's not have any international violence for a week before and a week after the Olympics. Putin seems to be listening to that, if not okay. So, all right, we're at the end of our hour. We'll stay on and have office hours briefly and continue on in the next, well, I'd say, take a look. I mean, that is what I'll try to do more explicitly as we continue through the course. We'll save a little time either at the beginning or mixed in with the other materials on Monday, if we can have you now look more closely at some of the readings and then think how these are beginning to fit together. That is, point is not just one idea from one reading, but how the pieces fit together as you're hearing, reading, thinking, and looking yourselves. Okay. So we can maybe, why don't we keep on the recording for say 5 minutes if we have anything quick, or we can shut it off if there's a private question in the office hours. And this screen share. Okay, there's the end of screen sharing.